Okay, welcome everybody. It is so wonderful to see live faces in the room. I unfortunately missed last week. I was on Zoom instead of in person, and it's much more fun to be in person after all this time. So, but nonetheless, welcome to all the people in the room, and welcome to all of you on Zoom. I'm glad that we can do a hybrid and increase participation in that way. I don't think I have any announcements to make in terms of the lecture, the Davis Lectureship Series, other than to say we have a great lineup, and I hope that you will continue to join us this quarter for Tuesday afternoons from 12:30 to 1:50, and there are, for those of you on Zoom, if we can entice you with a lunch, you can register ahead of time and show up in person, and there are lunches available. So with that, I'll shift to introducing the wonderful speaker we have for today, who is Dr. Martin Shapiro. He's going to share with us his new book, so very excited about that. Dr. Martin Shapiro obtained his medical degree from McGill University and a PhD in history and a master's in public health from UCLA. So very interdisciplinary person, super impressive. Not many people get an MD and a PhD in history. So I think that shows in the broad perspective of the book. He is a professor of medicine at Cornell and a distinguished professor emeritus of medicine and public health at UCLA. At UCLA, he was chief of the Division of General Internal Medicine and Health Services Research for 25 years. He is a general internist and a health services researcher who has studied accessibility of care and health disparities, scientific misconduct, pharmaceutical advertising, and scientific authorship, among other topics. He led a major national study of care for HIV disease. He is also interested in such conditions as hypertension and hepatitis C, also in empowering communities in relation to the research enterprise and in trying to improve health and healthcare for those most in need. He is an elected member of the American Society of Clinical Investigation and the Association of American Physicians, and is a past president of the Society of General Internal Medicine. His new book is titled The Present Illness, American Healthcare and Its Affiliations. And its afflictions, a pretty big difference in word there and meaning. For those of you who showed up, we have books available that I think Dr. Shapiro is also willing to sign. So with that, I will turn it over to him. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm really delighted to be here and look forward to a stimulating exchange of ideas that I raise in my book with colleagues here at the University of Chicago. So many of us are itching, longing, aching to fix American healthcare, but doing so has proven to be very challenging. In today's talk, I'm going to try and show that policy alone isn't going to get the job done. First, a bit of perspective. I'm a Canadian who moved to the US after adoption of the Universal Health Program in Canada that's called Medicare. I was pretty sure that the US would soon follow. I entered academic medicine like many others with the belief that producing evidence on the shortcomings of the system would lead to their amelioration. But we fell far short of that aspiration. When my wife was offered a job as a department chair at Mount Sinai Medical School in New York, I gave up my position as division chief at UCLA. And in considering what to do next, I decided to write a book about American healthcare in the hope of engendering serious discussion about how we can get back on the right track. In writing it, I had no difficulty enumerating problems in many domains, but it became apparent that all of these problems were not just incredibly bad luck. They must be linked. And to understand that, why that might be, I tried to connect my experiences in clinical practice, education, and research to evidence and theory across multiple disciplines. I learned a lot. It took much longer than I expected. The process was humbling. But I encourage you to consider stepping away at some point from what we do in academia and attempt to place what you've learned about our systems, accomplishments and shortcomings in a broader perspective and improve upon what I've written. We need that. If the world of healthcare were exposed to such ideas and were to consider them seriously, it might engender some humility about American healthcare and shake some out of their career-driven complacency and complicity. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. So what is rotten in the state of healthcare? As you know, disparities in access and health, high costs and poor outcomes. There we go. Are among the most prominent features of dysfunction. There's lack of insurance for many, even after passage of the Affordable Care Act, and underinsurance for even more. Our expenditures far exceed those in other countries as a percentage of gross domestic product. Back before 1970, the U.S. wasn't such a spendthrift. Expenditures were comparable to those in Canada and other countries relative to GDP. That changed when Canada adopted its national health plan. Over that period, the U.S. has steadily fallen behind other countries with advanced economies in life expectancy. Indeed, over the last half century, life expectancy has improved in almost all countries, but in the U.S. at 78.9 years before the pandemic, we lagged 3 to 5 years behind most advanced countries, and that difference has grown more since then. These are dashboard data of a failing state, and certainly not a shining city on the hill. So why has it been so hard to pull all the right levers and create policies to solve these problems? This is the grave of Gertrude Stein in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. When Gertrude was dying, it reported that she turned to Alice B. Toklas and asked, "What is the answer?" Alice remained silent, so Gertrude continued, "In that case, what is the question?" Supposedly her last words. Bertrand Russell similarly said that the greatest challenge to any thinker is stating the problem in a way that will allow a solution. I believe we are asking the wrong question about American healthcare. The problems are multifaceted and go well beyond the tried and true characterizations implicit in most policy proposals and research projects. Rather, the ways in which various groups of actors conceptualize health and healthcare, pursue their interests and perceived needs, and interact based on these conceptualizations, create impediments to a system that's rational, just, and efficient. Let's look at the groups of actors that I argue all stand in the way of equitable, efficient, and effective care. These are practicing physicians and their organizations, medical schools and universities, corporate providers of medical care, including hospitals, health systems, medical groups, dialysis, nursing home, and pharmacy companies, other corporations in healthcare, manufacturers of pharmaceuticals, biologics, machines, devices, and information systems, health insurance companies, and investors, but also scientists and scientific organizations, the government, employers, and patients, their families, employee groups, and many community organizations. I believe that three phenomena shape the circumstances and experience of healthcare in contemporary society. The treatment of healthcare and health itself as commodities by all actors within and without the system. The consciousness of the various actors, their attitudes, values, perceived needs, expectations, interests, and capacities, which condition their conceptualization of health and healthcare and much of their behavior in relation to it. And the nature of communication and relationships among these groups of actors, which reinforce existing arrangements and impede change. We can't solve the problems inherent in these phenomena through policy alone. Here are a couple of cases that make these issues more than mere abstractions. Luis was a 23-year-old in Central America with a mild learning disability who lived with his parents. He had congenital immune deficiency and had required immunoglobulin infusions from birth. Early on, he developed hepatitis C infection from an infusion. When Luis was 7, his parents moved to the US and he came for his care. We took care of him for 15 years. Meanwhile, his hep C progressed to end-stage liver disease. The liver transplant service declined to list him for transplant, saying he had no insight about his illness and his parents both worked, so he didn't take medicines consistently. They believed if he were transplanted, he wouldn't reliably take the meds needed to prevent rejection. My residents and I sat down with the family to discuss his situation in Spanish. It turns out that Luis had never missed a single dose of medicine. Because of his illness and disability, his loving parents had chosen to work different shifts, so he was never alone if he needed medicine or became ill. And he did understand the illness and the importance of taking the meds. His parents were totally devoted to keeping him well. Without the procedure, he'd die. We shared this information with the liver team, and they pointed out that he was an undocumented immigrant, and while coverage had been arranged for routine care, he did not have insurance to pay for the procedure. I spoke to the transplant surgeon who said he'd waive his fee, but we need to get the hospital to cooperate as well. The associate director of the hospital, which had surpluses of about $200 million or so a year at that time, told me that it was a considerable expense to do a transplant, and that even if they waived all the charges, the patient would be unable to pay for his transplant meds in the long run. I implored him to pursue it and see if Medi-Cal, California Medicaid, or others would provide some coverage given his long time in the country. He claimed they tried, but Medi-Cal refused. The hospital's decision was final. Fortunately, a hepatology fellow, as frustrated as us, was able to find another program in the region that agreed to take him, and we learned that they were able to get the procedure authorized. He was placed on the transplant waiting list. Luis's story illustrates many salient issues. Notwithstanding an apparently acceptable outcome, the system had failed him. Even after we showed he'd be able to take his meds, that his parents were extraordinarily supportive and his time in the country was mitigating, Luis would have been sent home to die. In American healthcare, some lives are cheap. In cases like Luis's, the problem isn't only the failure of some doctors who fail to collect vital information, but also the priorities of health system, including America's so-called best hospitals. A far from acceptable quality of communication with patients and their families also can stand in the way of patients getting the care they need. Frances was a 73-year-old social worker who survived a serious bout of cancer and kept working. One day she was admitted to another hospital with a serious infection, which led to extreme glucose elevation and caused her to lose consciousness. She was treated for the infection, but her mental status did not return to normal. She was transferred to our hospital where she did poorly. Her white blood cell count became extremely elevated, indicating the infection was getting much worse in spite of treatment. There was further deterioration of mental function. Strenuous efforts to save her were unsuccessful. She lapsed into coma and several organs failed as she relentlessly slid toward death. Frances had not completed an advance directive that would have specified preferences for treatment in such circumstances. Her daughter, who worked with patients in intensive care, understood the hopelessness of the situation and did know her mother's preferences. However, 2 brothers of Frances who lived overseas came into town. They were intensely religious and insisted she be kept on life support. Their niece did not agree, but deferred to the authority of her uncles. We tried to reason with them, noting that she had multi-organ failure and that intubating her would cause additional suffering in a hopeless situation.
They insisted that it was contrary to their religion not to do everything. Frances endured several more weeks of intensive care treatment on a ventilator until her family relented and allowed her to die. Unlike the previous case, the issue here was about ethical decision-making, not insurance. Some patients or their families make it very difficult to do what's humane and most appropriate for an individual, and to use healthcare resources in socially responsible ways with the goal of assuring that everyone can get access to care that has meaningful potential to increase the quantity or quality of life. Patient autonomy can be a mandate to allow a family member to make decisions supposedly on behalf of the patient, but often for reasons of their own that in the end extinguish the patient's voice rather than representing it, and with little or no consideration of the common good. My main point today is that fixing healthcare is so very difficult because of the interplay of consciousness, the commodified world of healthcare, and the toxic relationships and problematic communication that pervades it. Resolution of these challenges requires acknowledging this interplay and addressing it. I'll present some potential approaches to the problems identified, but few, if any, will come to pass unless we broadly address these phenomena that undermine progress. Let's consider the various groups of actors in turn. Major health systems include academic and non-academic ones, those that are for-profit and those supposedly not for profit. Behavioral distinctions aren't clear. They contribute to the problem in a number of ways. Early in my career, my department had a retreat and the speaker was a senior exec from Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. He regaled us with an account of their business strategy and how they increased sales. Then he paused and said, which you refer to as hospital admissions and outpatient visits. That was clarifying. Far too often, the business strategy of these systems is to maximize market share of covered lives, maximize reimbursement for services, minimize the risk of poor people with Medicaid or no insurance, especially needing lots of care, contract with healthy populations, develop and promote lucrative product lines, prioritize expensive procedures, make deals with industry, strive for 9-figure surpluses, and reward executives with 7 to 8-figure salaries, of which 30% nationally are performance-based. Can we alter the incentives for clinical corporations and their executives? Well, a lot of things would have to change. But how about, for starters, don't pay health system CEOs salaries up to 50 times what some of their doctors earn, and bonus payments to executives based on financial performance, and require full participation of all clinicians in Medicaid for health systems to maintain nonprofit status. Among other corporations in healthcare, the producers of goods are also interested in sales. These corporations are in the business of inducing demand. Pharma and the biologics advertise shamelessly to patients and providers, convincing the former that their products will extend life or improve its quality without regard to how much or at what cost. They raise their prices when they can, often recruiting academic economists to justify exorbitant so-called price points, extend patents with minor modifications, which is called evergreening, restrict competition, and struggle mightily to prevent negotiation of prices. Equipment manufacturers pressure medical groups to buy their latest products by letting it be known that competing clinical sites have done so, and they fight hard against taxes on their products. The market for information systems is an oligopoly in which pricing is prohibitive for small practices. They increase the cost of care and the work of the provider for benefits that may or may not be forthcoming. The health insurance industry sees single payer as an existential threat, and fiercely resists expansion of public coverage while prodding allies in government to privatize the more lucrative component of public programs. They also add to problems with the current system because to maximize revenue, they need to minimize risk, and too often do it by denying coverage for procedures or offering products with large copays and deductibles, and they add greatly to administrative costs. Their copays, deductibles, and denials are an enormous burden, saddling many with insurmountable medical debt. Other corporate elements like nursing homes and pharmacy and dialysis companies are determined to maintain and often greatly increase their revenue flow. As for investors, Hedge funds have moved aggressively into the health sector, seeking to inflate apparent value through maximizing billing revenue and cutting corners, then selling at large profits. Some talk about value-based care, which sounds great. However, when one such company, Oak Street Health, announced its acquisition by CVS recently, the value they spoke about was offering significant value to our shareholders, quote unquote. Gordon Gekko couldn't have said it any better. Thinking about all these groups of corporations, policy changes aimed at fixing corporate behavior are unlikely to have much impact without much broader changes. There are many wonderful and idealistic physicians, but practicing clinicians and their professional societies have economic interests that are quite obvious. The payment system reimburses procedures far better than evaluation and management. Inevitably, procedural specialty societies resist redistribution of income to cognitive fields by occupying up to 70% of the seats in the RVU Update Committee, which advises Medicare on fees. They often produce guidelines that justify their current activity, minimize risk by optimizing insurance type, and run the till as long as they can. Early in my career, residents at UCLA used to joke that the cardiologists there only had two indications for heart catheterization, lub and dub. These are traditionally what people call the two heart sounds. So anyone with a heartbeat was eligible. The ways in which the system pays for services shapes the way in which physicians practice. As you're all aware, I think, maybe not this audience, but income differences between procedural and cognitive fields are stark, and in fact have grown since the resource-based relative value scale was implemented in Medicare. At the same time, doctors were not selected into medical school primarily to be empathic, caring, and altruistic. Many physicians handle uncertainty poorly, are not well trained to limit care, and are more comfortable with narrow tasks like procedures than building relationships with patients. Accordingly, the choices that many make of specialties are driven by efficiency of income generation. Communicating effectively with patients is not well rewarded and often is actively avoided. As you can see here, the proportion of residency positions filled by US medical graduates bears a linear relationship to specialty incomes. The higher paying procedural fields generate many additional costs through their procedures besides the professional fees. Awareness of what the specialty choice means financially is, in a sense, a corrupting influence upon the career decisions that medical students make. Why doesn't society value the so-called cognitive fields like internal medicine, pediatrics, infectious disease, psychiatry, more than it does? Such work is no less complex and demanding and no less life-altering for patients. Part of the explanation, I think, is that clinicians, health systems, and the media do a poor job of getting that message out. I can relate illustrative stories in this regard from my experience. A patient who needed constant coaching and repeated discussions of the evidence and emotional support to stick with treatment for Hodgkin disease. A person who was dying and in pain but needed to hear from someone whom he trusted that it would be okay to end active treatment. A patient with severe hypertension and a serious mental illness that made it hard to adhere to a treatment and show up for appointments, who needed a clinician who would stick with her and keep her alive. A patient who was dispirited by multiple chronic conditions and needed her doctor not only to manage her complex regimen, but also to keep her spirits up. But the system doesn't reward such efforts, and too many clinicians don't prioritize them. Can we change clinicians' priorities and competencies? Here are some ideas. Pay doctors for their time, not for piecework. Specialty pay should differ only modestly and only to account for differences in time and training. Incentivize clinicians to seek psychotherapy to help them better understand and relate to patients, their needs and values. All physicians should have periodic training in communication, negotiation with patients, ethics, morals, and social responsibilities, the latter perhaps along with their hospital administrators. Mandate that procedural specialists and hospital administrators meet regularly to discuss strategies and set targets to reduce use of low-value care rather than the opposite. How about educational institutions? Universities and medical schools have a considerable interest in the status quo and are part of the problem. Medical school admissions are limited almost entirely to those with great GPAs and test scores and pay little attention to values and ability to empathize and communicate effectively. Not surprisingly, the great majority of those admitted have studied biological and physical sciences and related disciplines, and overwhelmingly represent those from privileged backgrounds and underrepresent Blacks and Hispanics. Medical schools do a poor job of identifying students with commitments to societal betterment that are more than window dressing on their applications. The undergraduate curriculum is science-based and biologically reductionist. Humanities and social sciences are at best an afterthought. The white coat ceremonies on entry are an exercise in triumphalism for people who have accomplished nothing but have been told that they've arrived. Students go through a well-described negative socialization and loss of idealism that medical schools don't show enough interest in arresting. And once selected, students don't learn nearly enough about how to relate to patients and next to nothing about ethical obligations and social responsibilities. Some who arrive purportedly intending to follow in the footsteps of Mother Teresa rapidly decide to pursue the highest paying specialties. Student debt can be considerable, but doesn't preclude eventually living in comfort, but it does provide a rationalization for those decisions. In postgraduate and clinical training, there are many wonderful teachers, but it is the exception, not the rule, when faculty model the kind of judicious, evidence-based application of technology and commitment to diverse populations that might make America less exceptional. Again, there's little exposure to the humanities and social sciences, few opportunities to address doctors' personal challenges that stand in the way of effective relationships with patients, and little effort to assure that they're able to communicate effectively with patients. Some institutions try hard to provide positive outpatient experiences, but in many programs, they are famously awful. Residents who are pressed for time are assigned patients whom the faculty don't want to see. These features of the training, as well as the greater attention given to developing procedural skills rather than effective communication, promotes choice of procedural careers. Can we fix medical education? There are lots of potential strategies for changing attitudes, values, and priorities and career choices of medical school graduates. Here are a few. Replace pre-medical science requirements with humanities, ethics, and social sciences. Lewis Thomas proposed that 4 decades ago. Develop mechanisms to identify and select applicants driven by altruism, not prestige and income, and who demonstrate capacity for empathy, psychological openness, and sound moral and ethical foundations and sustained commitment to societal well-being. Allow members of underserved communities to nominate medical school matriculants. Ethics, morality, and social responsibility and communication skills should comprise up to half of the first 2 years of the medical school curriculum and be integrated into clinical training, which should consistently encourage psychological openness and give more weight to social context of disease and less to biological reductionism. Clinically, medical schools are no less interested than the private sector in generating revenue by favoring good insurance and maximizing market share and profits and marketing lucrative product lines and miracles. The health of the public is not a priority beyond the occasional lecture on social aspects of medicine. Practices are often segregated by insurance type. As with their teaching hospitals, academic practices' business plans reflect the priority of revenue generation. Grow market share to maximize reimbursement, minimize risk, run the till. This is the so-called hidden curriculum, and students learn these lessons very well, and they grow up to emulate the practice patterns and the values of their faculty. When I entered medical school, my uncle, a fervent progressive man, commented that I would have a choice between figuring out how to make a lot of money or how to best serve humanity, and that on the basis of my choice, people could then judge my worth as a human being. Well, That was a provocation, but that provocation was a gift because I still ask myself if I'm doing enough. Many medical students and residents, and indeed their faculty, would benefit from such provocation. Almost all medical school research funding comes from the federal government and industry. Medical schools actively seek revenue from patents and royalties. Priority of maximizing such funding, as well as grants and contracts, affects hiring decisions. Social scientists and humanists don't bring in any patents, and their grants are rather smallish, so relatively few are hired, which limits intellectual diversity in medical schools. Promotion is driven by funding and publication count, and rarely is much consideration given to the importance or challenges of social and community-based research in hiring and promotion decisions. In thinking about science, it's worth considering Robert Merton's characterization of the ethos of science. He identified 4 components: universalism, it's subject to verification, anyone can contribute; communalism, the findings of science are products of collaboration and assigned to the community; the ethos is incompatible with technology defined as private property; disinterestedness, which is objectivity about the outcome; and organized skepticism, which is the suspension of judgment and detached scrutiny of beliefs. Does this ethos characterize medical research today? Well, not entirely. Basic scientists tend to be excited about discovery, aren't really educated about societal context or social responsibilities of scientists. Since the Bayh-Dole Act passed in 1980, patents can be lucrative to scientists and their employers, along with large grants and contracts. For some, these are a consummation devoutly to be wished. And these priorities are very apparent to their students, and affects their attitudes towards what is important in science. In terms of clinical research, when it's funded by industry, payments can be generous, but priorities are often those of industry, and intellectual freedom may be quite limited. In terms of policy research, most policy and health services researchers tend to genuflect before the status quo in terms of healthcare organization, and few studies look at substantial transformation. Most focus on small changes and limited populations. To paraphrase California politician Jess Unruh's famous axiom, money is the mother's milk of academic research, and the NIH is the source. In thinking about where they dispense their milk, look at their statement: to seek fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems and the application of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. Its programs are designed to improve the health of the nation by conducting and supporting research in causes, diagnosis, prevention, and cure of human diseases. They don't treat all parts of this mission statement equally. Scientific organizations and funders like NIH keep promising imminent miracles as justification for increasing their share of the budget for research. Their relentless pursuit of molecular explanations affects the practice of medicine, encouraging attitudes towards disease as being largely asocial, and influences public perceptions as well. They produce a narrow vision of what science could be, promulgating flavors of the decade to keep money flowing their way, and certainly not towards other kinds of research that might have a larger impact on the health of the population. And of course, they defend their budgets. When I wrote my first research grant proposal for NIH, which was an HIV outcome study, I got an excellent score, but it wasn't funded. When I spoke to the project officer at NIAID, where I submitted it, he was enthusiastic about the proposal, but told me not to resubmit there because the director did not consider such research to be his responsibility. He redirected me toward what is now AHRQ. So here's a breakdown of the NIH's nearly $50 billion budget, along with those of ARC and PCORI. Some large institutes do support some health services and behavioral research, but many fluctuate wildly from year to year in such support, or when there's a change in directorship of the institute, the support dramatically decreases. Others essentially never support such research. A few consistently do, but most of the ones that do have budgets that are less than 1% of that of the NIH. Can we make medical science more responsive to societal needs? The scientific community doesn't appear to be in a hurry to change its priorities. Here are a few measures that might help a bit. Training and social responsibility in science should be a core and substantial feature of scientific education. Revenue from inventions funded by the federal government should accrue largely to the government, not to scientists, their institutions, or corporations. Research on bringing effective care to populations should be NIH's highest priority, and half the members of the advisory council of each NIH institute should be nominated by members of diverse communities affected by disorders in their area of focus. Government, which can be part of the solution, is often part of the problem. In the case of the US federal government, they tend to avoid policies that would necessitate raising taxes. They are susceptible to corporate and interest group pressures. They're reluctant to limit care and offend constituencies. They ineffectively regulate the FDA, Medicare fees, and insurance products. They overpay for procedures compared to cognitive services. Their policies promote ever more sub-specialization, and they tend to prefer moonshots, which are typically asocial biologic areas, rather than society-wide programs that might do more good. Are patients and their families the innocent victims in all this? I think not, although many suffer the consequences of the behavior of other actors. Just as the scientist, the clinician, the pharmaceutical company, and the health system see healthcare as a commodity, so too do many patients. They want their share of the goods. Now, many would prefer not to pay. When healthcare consumes 18% of GDP, who wants to work 7.5 hours a week to pay for their medical care? But they want the prescription, the blood test, the scan, the bed in the ICU for their family member. Consider my patient who insisted on an antibiotic prescription for a cold, stating it always goes to sinusitis, and then informing me that he was a medical malpractice attorney. Beyond that, many treat life itself as a kind of commodity, wanting more days, weeks, months of life, whatever the cost or consequences for others, as was the case for Francis, the social worker discussed earlier. There is not more thought of the common good among the public than among those working in the health sector. Why is that? In part, it reflects a world in which almost everything is commodified, in which autonomy is unmediated by concern about dire consequences for the health of the public, in which some people feel entitled to get whatever they want, and in which many people often are not well connected to others and are replete with loneliness, insecurity, dissatisfaction with life in general, and beaten down by the world. They may come to healthcare looking for solace, comfort, companionship, a heart that's open to them in a way that the larger world is not. Consider my patient whose life was chaotic and had few or no friends, who called me constantly with a litany of complaints. On a day when she was going to be evicted from her motel for non-payment and her son was off playing basketball, she called me to say she couldn't take it and would kill herself, but could not go to the emergency department because she had no money to pay for a cab. She pleaded with me to come to her, which I did, and I provided the cab fare she needed. But after a few minutes of talking to me, she felt better and was no longer suicidal, then asked me if she could use the money to pay for cigarettes. Consider the actress whose career never took off and came pleading for help, saying that she had consulted 200 doctors and none had been able to solve her problems. Consider the man in his mid-60s who'd spent his life looking for love in all the wrong places and came in requesting testosterone and growth hormone so he could pursue relationships with people 1/3 his age. Consider the refugee who was depressed and would not take medicine or see a therapist, and whose family understood that her problem was depression, but she came in frequently with pain in yet another part of her body, insisting that that was the problem and demanding more tests. Unlike those demanding care out of entitlement who often get what they want, these individuals encounter professionals who are not equipped to give them what they need. Their beliefs and attitudes may be shaped by a government promising moonshots, a medical profession that doesn't know how to set limits, a scientific establishment that holds out the promise of imminently conquering diseases that afflict them, lack of clarity from government about what limits are reasonable, and dogma from some religious leaders about when life begins and how it should end. Robert Bellah and his colleagues' wonderful book, Habits of the Heart, provides useful insights. They wrote, American individualism has become an autonomy dissociated from meaningful societal integration, damaged by destruction of subtle ties that bind people together, leaving them frightened and alone. Many abandon any notion of finding meaning in relation to society as a whole, and in particular in the idea of the common good. When education becomes an instrument for individual careerism, it cannot provide personal meaning or civic culture. There's a fractured imbalance between individualism and communitarianism. Underlying the actions of all these actors are the values and consciousness of society as a whole outside of the health sector that include acquisition, exploitation, inequity, lack of communal concerns, mistrust, atomization, lack of fulfillment. Greed is good, poverty is weakness, as Matthew Desmond, who's speaking here tomorrow, I gather, wrote in his recent book, Poverty by America. Decline of religion as a source of support, failure of public discourse to address these issues. In healthcare, this manifests both in relation to the economic and political behavior of actors and in terms of their inner lives. Healthcare is highly commodified, and health and life as well. Everyone wants a piece of the $3 trillion pie. Some actors induce demand and raise prices. Others seek greater market share of those with good insurance and market products to them. Some run the till and never say no to a patient. Some are interested in inventions to enrich them, seeking royalties, consultation fees, and starting companies. Patients are complicit. They want their share of the commodities of care, health, and life. All these groups are pushing for the system to do more. On the other hand, insurers, the government, and employers, each in their own ways and for their own reasons, want to limit care and its cost and coverage in ways not necessarily consistent with optimal health. Only public sector providers and other clinics for the poor are trying to do the right thing, albeit with inadequate resources. When care is commodified, there's a disincentive to spend time talking to patients, relating to them, getting to know them, caring for them. There's an incentive to do more, selling people pacemakers, imaging studies, pathology services, hospitalizations, surgeries for marginal indications. There's excessive consultation. There are higher copays, costlier insurance, which exacerbates disparities, needless consumption of some resources like ICU days, which limits access for others. And there's little time and few resources to address social determinants of disease and the context in which patients experience both disease and treatment. And there's diversion of resources from other societal needs like social services, education, and infrastructure, which could do more for health. Well, can healthcare even be optimized in a commodified marketplace? Ethicist Edmund Pellegrino argues that putting clinicians at financial risk can lead to loss of professionalism. Market relationships rarely extend beyond the act of selling commodities. This has grave consequences in medicine. Only government will place public good above private interests. Economist Kenneth Arrow wrote, healthcare can't meet the conditions of a perfectly functioning market due to uncertainty about the quality of products patients purchase. Injury to some caused by unconstrained markets may not be offset by benefit to others. Pellegrino and Daniel Callahan conclude that commodified healthcare is inherently unjust. And among advanced economies, the freewheeling marketplace in US healthcare is perhaps the least efficient while producing poorer outcome. But commodification isn't the only problem with healthcare, and addressing it, although necessary, won't be sufficient. The consciousness of the actors is no less potent a force. Clinicians who enjoy doing things that are concrete and short-term, who have trouble communicating or saying no, aren't going to limit care and change the system's priorities. Medical schools can't help but be generative and want to train more and more specialists, nor do they know how to break with their propensity for selecting students based on a narrowly defined vision of merit rather than on the basis of capacity to care. Corporate leaders lack training or interest or incentives to pursue societal obligations. And scientists really like to figure things out and are mostly oblivious to societal problems. And politicians have their moonshots and imagine dramatic policies, but don't want to offend any constituencies. Patients who are run down by life in our society, who are isolated, who need human contact, who have pain that's literal and figurative, and who don't trust medical authorities from whom they're socio-culturally distant, and who are confused by misinformation about what science has to offer, look to medicine for the healing touch. The discourse that ensues is very disappointing. Doctors sell procedures to their patients, provider systems advertise miracles, professional societies guard their interests, educators promulgate the values of the status quo, scientists and the NIH make extravagant promises, corporate speech induces demand and blocks progress, politicians prefer moonshots to anything else, media sensationalize reports of scientific advances and fails to put them in perspective, rarely reporting on systemic problems in care. Health policy researchers rarely threaten the status quo, and any public intellectuals who would like to balance the discourse are drowned out. Jürgen Habermas's theory of communicative action is relevant. We can only consider it briefly. But basically, progress in society depends on a common understanding of ends and the nature of interaction across those who control capital and produce commodities, those who develop and implement policies, individuals and groups seeking interpersonal influence, and the values and beliefs of members of society. And in general, capitalists and policymakers communicate very well together, but other elements are shut out. In healthcare, the power rests with capital, abetted by government and professional organizations. But absent common understanding, adversarial situations, malpractice suits, insurance denials, and collection agencies, misdirected priorities in research, clinical programs, and education, and poor communication and clinical encounters all ensue. We're left with a set of relationships in which all the players tend to reinforce the worst instincts in the other groups. And far too often, they influence one another in ways that exacerbate problems rather than solve them. And all these groups lose sight of the common good. The implications for healthcare are painfully evident in the successful interventions to obstruct many efforts to bring US programs in line with what has been accomplished in other countries with advanced economies. In the 1910s, the National Manufacturers Association and the American Federation of Labor opposed mandatory sickness insurance for industrial workers. In the 1940s, the American Medical Association campaigned against Truman's National Health Insurance Plan and called social insurance of any kind communist or totalitarian. In the 1960s, the AMA's frontman, Ronald Reagan, warned that if Medicare were adopted, other federal programs, quote, will invade every area of freedom as we have known it, and one day we will awake and find that we have socialism, unquote. And the pharmaceutical industry killed Clinton's health plan with its famous Harry and Louise advertising campaign. So what's to be done? Policy change can't be sustained when almost every actor wants it to fail. A number of philosophers, George Lukács, Karl Korsch, Antonio Gramsci, Herbert Marcuse, and Habermas, have written about the prospects for substantial change and argue that just pulling a policy lever without addressing consciousness, values, attitudes, expectations, perceived and unmet needs will lead to failure in the end. And in healthcare, there are so many material goods at stake and so many non-material factors that mesh with current arrangements that all the groups are more inclined to bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. So what we're left with is a question of whether any meaningful change is possible. There are so many actors caught up in commodification of care, are limited by their values, attitudes, and perceived needs, and are promulgating or receiving problematic communication. We talked about not all, but most of these problems in this talk. We need to take on a large number of the challenges in this maelstrom of dimensions of commodification, consciousness, and communication. What can academics do? Well, educators, clinicians, and researchers need to think strategically about how many problems they can take on in their own institutions and their own behavior, but that is not sufficient. When there are so many barriers to progress, we really can't ignore any of them. Vincenzo Camuccini's painting of the death of Caesar represents artistically our current conundrum in healthcare. It wouldn't have been enough to neutralize Cassius or Brutus. Analogous to the fervent opposition of actors in healthcare to the prospect of reform, everyone who greeted Caesar in Pompey's theater on the Ides of March wanted him dead. Changing policy won't be enough. Transformation needs to occur contemporaneously with the levels of policy consciousness and communication. Combination therapy is going to be needed, and it can't be limited to the realm of government policy. Until that happens, innovations like the ACA, although representing some real progress, are really like treating lymphoma or HIV with one drug. They'll make a difference for some, but will be undone by the underlying malady. And you may ask, can we achieve justice and equity in just one sector of society? Passing some laws and adopting regulations can help in some respects if those efforts overcome opposition, but there are many problems that such measures won't address. And we can hardly expect all of the actors in healthcare to unilaterally disarm and embrace an egalitarian, communitarian, ethical, non-commodified health sector when the rest of society is moving in a very different direction. But we shouldn't shy away from thinking boldly and broadly about what it will take to achieve justice for all in healthcare and society. In addition to changes in clinical practice, medical education, and science we discussed early, there's lots of other changes that need to occur. And some of them require government action. Provide the same insurance coverage to everyone. That would be single payer. Separate is never equal in healthcare or anywhere else. Convene a multidisciplinary group without major conflicts of interest to make annual recommendations to the government about the magnitude of budgets for national programs of personalized healthcare and public health, and how to allocate them to assure that equitable and timely care is available to all. And government subsidies for training excessive specialists. If clinicians are to continue to be paid fees for service, radically revise the fee schedule. And approval of new treatments should be contingent on ensuring that they're cost-effective and available to all. We also need to address communication. Limit health system advertising to promoting public health, not promoting their miracles and building their market share. Stop overselling the implications of biomedical science. Stop selling patients meds and procedures they don't need. Provide greater transparency about all medical prices, including about what the doctor earns from a specific patient when performing that procedure, and establish media standards for more balanced reporting on the implications of research. And finally, for the patients and the public, provide the social services and financial and psychological resources needed without financial or administrative barriers to address problems best dealt with in those ways. Educate patients and the public about the common good and fair distribution of limited medical resources. Offer much clearer communication about the limits of what medicine can accomplish. Train clinicians who can relate to diverse communities and incorporate communities into all levels of decision-making in research, education, and clinical care. To change the trajectory of healthcare, we need to make it a priority to transform discourse about healthcare and relationships within healthcare. There's no equal justice under law without equal healthcare for all. Change not only policy, but also the consciousness of corporations, practitioners, and consumers of healthcare, all of whom regard it as a bundle of goods rather than a potential societal resource. Pursue consensus that we're all in the same boat, and don't give up with every failed effort at reform. 2 millennia ago, Rabbi Tarfon said, "It is not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it." Thank you.
Great, thanks so much.
Do I escape or exit? I'm gonna have to exit.
So we
There we
can
go.
start by taking questions from the audience in person, and then I think some of the folks on Zoom will, can put their questions in the chat.
No, I don't know if I did the right,
This is, I'm not sure. It's on. Okay. Yep, it's on.
what? Oh, did I do something wrong?
No, you're fine. No worries. But I don't think this is distracting. It's okay. Any questions from, yeah.
You started your presentation with how the United States is very low on health status related to other developed countries. But I guess I would argue that the problem with that is not so much our medical care system as is our one of the few developed countries that will tolerate a permanent poverty class, where environment and housing and nutrition, all those things affect health status, I think, far more than medical care. So how do we raise up the priority of that? If we're going to spend $3.5 trillion on health care, how do we get those other needs that so impact health up to the level of sharing some of those healthcare resources?
It's a terrific question. Those who've looked at it have noted that public expenditures on healthcare in the U.S. are actually comparable to public expenditures on the cost of healthcare in other countries. But our public expenditures don't cover the whole population and don't do a great job of doing it. The overall cost of healthcare plus all the social services in the U.S. is actually comparable to other countries. So what's really being sacrificed by our ridiculously overwrought system is that those resources aren't available for infrastructure. They aren't available to support social workers and community workers and educational programs and financial services that might make a big difference. And of course, there are other factors in society, but it is really striking how relentlessly the US has moved off that line of life expectancy, and the recent years decline in life expectancy. Larry Summers commented recently that it brings back recollections of that happening in the Soviet Union before its collapse as a country. So I think it's a very, very serious situation, and I think you're right that sort of reappropriation is necessary. But surely healthcare is part of what people need, and surely it should be just and equitably distributed.
Okay, more questions from the audience? I have a couple questions, and maybe other people can chime in when you give a little thought to it. I mean, the reform you set out is quite ambitious. And obviously the setup of the problem demands an ambitious reform.
Mm-hmm.
But it does leave one with the feeling of sort of like, where do we start?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so for people wanting to put their foot into taking action and working on reform, I guess one question I have is, what advice would you give them? Where should they start? And I suspect part of the answer is where do you kind of broke it out by government, physician, providers, and patients. So, in the public, right? So I wanted to start with, you talked a lot about medical education reform.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it seems that we've been talking about all of these things for a very long time, right? But also medical education reform. And maybe I don't know, do you think we've made any progress towards admitting different students? And, I think it's New York University that now has no tuition for medical school. So can you point to some examples where they're doing a good job around medical education, or or what do you think about that? How do you start there, given how long we've been talking about this?
I wouldn't start with New York University because I think it remains to be seen what the impact of that is going to be on the choices that people make about careers. I work with students in Cornell's medical school, and we have a questionnaire. It's for our research program. And one of the things we ask them is if they believe that specialty choice will be influenced by student debt. And so Cornell has adopted a program that guarantees that students will graduate debt-free. They won't have free tuition necessarily, but they'll graduate debt-free. And still a large proportion of the students say that student debt is going to influence their career choices. What's really being said is it's very difficult to ignore the fact that you can earn 2 to 3 times as much as an orthopedic surgeon as you can as a pediatrician. And so the students line up and, strategize for how they can get one of those orthopedic slots. So I don't think those problems are easily solved. I don't think any of these problems are easily solved. But I think, first of all, recognizing the breadth of the problem should be acknowledged. And I think everyone should work on whatever they can. Certainly you can work in your own institution and, stand up to the powers that be when they don't sign a Medicaid contract or whatever, or insist that, patients like Luis be treated with dignity and respect as human beings. There are little things that anyone can do. I think some policy wonks do a disservice when they suggest that putting a particular incentive, on some page of the ACA to encourage more doctors to take care of Medicaid patients is going to, in the long run, make very much of a difference. And we know that it didn't do very much. There ought to be a vision that it is unacceptable not to treat everyone equivalently. And America is a long way from that. But the problem again goes back to what Bella and his colleagues talked about, which is the dissociation from a sense of the common good as being a driving principle in American society. The Federalist Papers, I think Madison in one of the Federalist Papers talked about the common good as being one of their core notions about what they were trying to do when they were putting this together. So we're a long way from that, and there's a long, hard struggle. And certainly, knowing a little of history, a lot of struggles go on for a long time. But if you can fight the fight, if you can align with the forces that are for making the world a better place, then you're going to do some good. My uncle's suggestion that the choices you make will define your worth as a human being, that we should all continually ask ourselves that. And as I was giving a different talk a few years back, I posed the question, well, what would he say now at this point in my career? And the answer was, he would say that the matter is not yet settled because there's still more that you can do. And I think that's true for all of us. Yeah.
Is the role of physicians within transformative change. And I mean, you got into this question of payment and salaries and kind of the concerning amount of money that physicians make, but it also seems like you're kind of positioning physicians as being part of the change. And I guess I'm wondering, to what extent should physicians be part of or be active or leading participants in the type of change you're calling for, given all of the really concerning ways in which, which you've described, and I see in your book, from the AMA's lobbying power, from the way that physicians themselves have been able to financialize both what you describe as their commodification of healthcare services, but also the way they themselves have contributed to consolidation, buying practices, selling practices. I mean, I guess I'm asking, should we position physicians as leaders in this change that you're calling for?
I think we should, well, your point is very well taken. And I don't think physicians need to lead it. I think there's a book that came out in the last year or so where someone was talking about how physicians can lead the change. Well, I mean, there are some physician groups that are very progressive. I contribute money to some of them that are advocating for Medicare for all and other kinds of things like that. But I don't think that they have the breadth of understanding of the kinds of problems that need to be addressed. And similarly, I talked about how, like for my patient, there was no one there to talk to them, to help them deal with their life problems. The physicians need to be able to empathize with that, and that's a big deficiency currently. But they're also not the ones who are going to be able to solve every problem, and the other kinds of resources need to be available as well to help people. And in terms of the lead, I think people from every sector of society ought to have as much right as physicians to play a prominent role in defining the change. Physicians can bring a certain amount of perspective and expertise about clinical conditions and what's possible and so on. But I think we need physicians, we need the public, for sure we need the public. We need politicians who aren't afraid of their shadows, which I think that's almost universal currently. We need scientists who are going to be more honest about what can and can't be accomplished. We need educators who are willing to adopt a different model. And of course, a lot of what people do is driven by financial considerations. Some of it's driven by their values and so on. I think the change will be slow. I mean, if today we I call these proposals quixotic, because they are. But even if every medical school changed today to the model of medical education that I talked about, it would be a number of decades before it would really have much of an effect on the profession. And still they might be, if other sorts of things don't change, it would be undermined by the relentless commodification of care, by the demands in society, by the needs people have. I mean, some students choose these high-paying specialties because their family expects it of them. I remember there was a famous clinical epidemiology professor at Yale, Alvin Feinstein, who, when he would go home and see his mother, she would always be concerned about him and said, "But do you have an office?" Life is complex and society is complex, but these problems are urgent. I mean, there's these vast differences in life expectancy across groups in this society. The US is falling behind other countries. The healthcare system is bankrupting us. Something's got to give, and everyone who can work on it ought to work on it. Yeah.
You started the talk and compared Canada and the United States, and that brought to mind what's happened now where Canada has allowed, let's say, a change in end of life care without the kind of hoops that you have to go through in Oregon if you decide at the end of your life or with a terminal diagnosis as a patient that maybe you don't want the chemo, you don't want all those procedures, you'd rather maybe not go out so quietly in the night, but you'd rather have an earlier termination of your life. I don't know. This is something that's come up again and again, is the amount of money the US spends at the end of people's lives for all these various procedures and treatments. And I don't know what you think, what kind of role it would play to change policy. And maybe we are moving in the direction of having more options across many states, maybe with fewer hoops to jump through, to allow members of the public, if they so choose, to not continue such expensive treatments.
There's a difference between not continuing to intubate someone and actively ending their life. And I think there are certainly situations in which that's appropriate, but it's a very complex thing, and it's easy for something like that to be abused, either by the system or perhaps by family members, who have ulterior motives and so on. So that needs to be done very carefully. But that's separate from the extraordinary use of resources in, I mean, we did one study where we found that people dying with lung cancer, a large proportion of them were getting chemo right up to the last couple of weeks of their life. And that's not unusual. I can remember a case where a doctor whose very old mother was in the ICU, very, very old mother in her 90s, wanted her to be kept alive past, this is in late December, past the start of the new year because the tax implications were going to change. Well, come on. We can do better than that, can't we? Yeah. But yeah.
Thank you so much for this very inspiring lecture. I know that the title is Whether Health Policy Can Be the Solution Like a Law. Actually, after hearing your lecture, I'm kind of convinced or reinforced my prior belief that health policy could be a very important solution. Because one of the slides you mentioned 3 domains, the health policy, healthcare organization, and effective communication. I think there are actually a lot of policies there addressing healthcare organizations and communication and incentivize providers to talk with each other. I think, although in the reality, they may or may not be effective. So I wonder if you can comment a little bit about why some of the well-intended health policy may not work in the real life. And I think the people who develop and implement the policy are different. So maybe that could.
So you say that I prove the opposite of my thesis. I think that health policy can help a lot in a lot of ways, but there are limits to what health policy can accomplish because of these other forces in society that affect the consciousness of the people within healthcare and of society as a whole, the patterns of communication that go on and so on, that are much more difficult to regulate. And so, yes, we need to address policy. Yes, we need to do everything we can. Yes, I send money to support physicians for a national health plan every year, even though I know it's not going to do everything that needs to be done. But we should be inspired by the people who try to do things. I was reading about this guy who was about to be convicted in a Russian court. He stood there and said, I have nothing to say in my defense because you have no right to be accusing me. And I will stand by this. And this country needs to get rid of its dictator and so on. Very courageous. He was standing, even though his situation was hopeless, he stood up for it. So I think solving these problems arguably is not quite hopeless, but it's, it's a long way to go to fix things. But people should struggle. You can struggle through policy, you can struggle through changing values, you can struggle through education and so on. Did I shut off the Zoom by mistake or no? No? Okay.
I have a question about what you think is the quality of the American health system, because obviously, as we have more resources maybe than other countries, we might have the ability to provide more specialty care, or we have access to different types of treatments that maybe other countries don't have. But I also maybe feel like there's an illusion that the American healthcare might be better than in other countries. And so I guess my question would be do you think that there is a quality of American healthcare that is better than in other countries, or is it more of just like you said, an illusion? And then, or I said, excuse me, but I kind of piggybacking off of that, how do you feel the idea that the trust that people have in their doctors, or the trust that people have in their physicians, when we know that physicians have alternative incentives to maybe not necessarily do what's right or what's best or would be the most cost effective, and yet patients have so much trust in them because I feel who else are you going to go to other than your doctor? So I guess what would you say to managing your healthcare as an autonomous individual within a system that is like within a healthcare system that can be very like not in your best interests.
I think that technologically, the US is very advanced. There are other countries that are technologically advanced, but also try to balance things a lot more and make sure that everyone has access to something. And one reason why we can spend zillions of dollars on people in the Upper East Side of Manhattan at the end of life is because we're not spending money on people who live further up in Manhattan or in the South Bronx. Never mind at the end of life, which ends sooner, but earlier than that. So there is this terrible problem of equity. I think it's an empiric question as to how well the US does. The US, for example, often disseminates new treatments or new evidence a little bit more quickly. I think they did that with mammography years ago and so on. So there are many bright points, but I know of no one who would give up their employer-based insurance and sign up for Medicaid if they had a choice. And 90 million people last week, it's going down because of the policy change, had Medicaid. So what do we think of that? And Medicaid programs should be very stingy in terms of what they will authorize. Some of the work I've done in hepatitis C, we see great reluctance in many Medicaid programs to fund treatments that are life-saving. So, the U.S. system has certain things. And yes, a lot of people trust their physicians, perhaps more than they should. There are a lot of great doctors out there. It's a problem. The system encourages people to not necessarily act in the greatest way.
Okay, we might have room for one last question, if there is one.
I'll just add a question and a comment. When we're talking about end of life and perhaps making choices at the end of life, I think one area that the health system in the U.S. does very poorly is having conversations about end of life and what the expectation and wishes of the patient are. And that's where we need to change that discussion from end of life to be a preventative health discussion. Is who is your healthcare power of attorney if you should become non-decision making? Because we across the Midway have a lot of patients that don't have those discussions, and that's where the expenses really start to creep up. Is are we giving the patients the care that they want, or the care that we have to give them because they show up at our door?
That's a great point. And unfortunately, I think the way that has to happen, and I think it's implied in your comment, is that it shouldn't be at the end of life when these discussions occur. It should be in the context of everybody's ongoing medical care. Unfortunately, what happens is people come into the hospital, none of this has been thought through, things are looking bad. So the intern is sent, the 26-year-old person who has no experience with life and death stuff, is sent into the room to have the goals of care discussion, supposedly, with the patient. Why should the patient trust them? We know that African Americans are less likely to accept limits of care than whites. And why not? They don't trust the doctor to necessarily be behaving in their best interest. So everyone needs to have a doctor. That's not currently the case. And they need to have a doctor who they can trust, and then they can have those conversations. Now, your attitudes and values might change over time, but that would be a starting point.
All right. Well, I think we're out of time, but thank you so much. This was really stimulating.
So I'd be happy to sign those books for anyone who wants. I ask that they be available in lieu of an honorarium. So this will make me happy if I get to sign.